Okay, well, hello everybody. Welcome to this session on piracy and plagiarism, something that fascinated me. Most recently, we're penalising students, but we'll leave that aside and talk about more interesting things in this session. I'm Edwin Rose from the University of Cambridge. And without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker, Trevor Barnes from the University of British Columbia, who's going to be speaking about the deadly politics of two economic ideas in transit, shootout in Santiago, Chile in 1973. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I did want to say at the outset that there is in fact a third alliterative P to add to the session title, which is Pinochet, Augusto Pinochet, the Chilean dictator, who's going to be a central character in my presentation. So there are three Ps, piracy, plagiarism, and Pinochet. And I guess we'll have to see whether this makes the session coherent. So let me begin. Following Chilean Air Force rocket attacks on the presidential palace in Santiago and an assault by Chilean troops, Chile's first elected socialist president, Salvador Allende, was dead by 2 o'clock on September the 11th, 1973. It was the first September the 11th tragedy. Allende's presidency passed to the head of the Chilean armed forces, Augusto Pinochet. It ended one traveling economic idea that was British-based, albeit with a start in Cold War America, cybernetic state planning, and began another that had journeyed from Hyde Park, South Chicago, free market neoliberalism, and set within Pinochet's murderous authoritarian state. By using the case study of the 1973 Chilean coup, on either side of which were practiced two diametrically opposed ideas of the economy, I'm going to make a case for the study of the geography of ideas. Geography plus what political scientists, Mark Blyth and others since the late 1990s, have called an ideational approach, applied to understanding the historical emergence of big economic ideas and their facilitating institutions, particularly the rise of neoliberalism. Blyth argues that key to that emergence is either an exogenous or endogenous, interposing disruptive crisis. For Blyth, crisis induces significant uncertainty, sweeping away old certitude, generating creative space for establishing either brand new ideas or existing ideas that, because of previous hegemonic forces, have been consigned to an ideational waiting room where they are never called, that is, until they are. It's not that these ideas come from nowhere, as Blyth says, rather because of uncertainty provoked by crisis. The ideas that subsequently gain traction are not predetermined. Crisis provides elbow room, latitude and play for trying things out, for experimentation. You never know what will happen until it happens. Nor does Blyth argue that ideas matter all the time. They matter only in certain specific circumstances, mattering most of all in moments of economic crisis. Missing from Blyth's framework is any meaningful geography. That is Jim Secor's concern, knowledge in transit, circulating knowledge. Ideas in Blyth's work are not geographically mobilized, from or to any place, have no movement, experience no spatially diffusing mutation. Insofar as there is a geography in Bly's work, it is based on a flattening methodological nationalism defined by a pinhead conceived country units. This conception, geography becomes, as Tom Giron puts it, at best idle backdrop, mere description. What's needed, as again Giron says, is a geography with agency, exerting a force of its own on the direction and pace of knowledge and belief on what becomes true. So by using the case study of the 1973 Chilean coup, my purpose is to try and add that missing geography, to geographize an ideational approach to show that geography is a tie that binds. Further, geography is attentive not only to the circulation of ideas, but possesses other kindred productive concepts that enrich and fill out the larger geographical understanding of knowledge in transit, such as place, space, scale, interaction, and network. So drawing on this expanded geographical conceptual vocabulary, my aim is to present an ideational account that takes circulating knowledge seriously. It was a minor miracle that Salvador Allende, the Marxist physician turned politician, was elected Chilean president in 1970. Not only was there domestic opposition, but scaled up Cold War fueled global opposition. The US fomented a coup immediately after the election, only thwarted, according to Henry Kissinger, who approved the plan, because of, quote, an incompetent bunch of Chilean operatives. Allende's Chilean path to socialism, that he announced in his first post-election speech in November 1970, included nationalization of the country's large-scale industries, copper and banking, later the telephone service, operated then by a subsidiary of IT&T, and followed by land redistribution and the government administration of health and education. In Bly's terms, this was the first crisis, creating a significant uncertainty, an abrupt shift from a market-based economy in which the largest actors were foreign-owned multinationals, to socialism, in which the economy's commanding heights were owned and operated by the state. The uncertainty allowed for a degree of experimentation. In this case, the experimentation was carried out by a 20-year-old tech-savvy, mathematically inclined, politically radical industrial engineer, Fernando Flores. He was put in charge of nationalizing and managing state enterprises for the Allende government. Seeking an alternative to the commissar-heavy Soviet Central Command economy model, he sought a new knowledge in transit. In 1971, he traveled to London's elite clubland, to the Athenaeum on Pall Mall, to meet the management consultant and cybernetician whom he thought could help. The charismatic, volatile, sveltely attired, briefly slept, protean Stafford Beard. Driving a Rolls Royce, living in the home county's stockbroker belt in a large country house that included a heated swimming pool, remote-controlled indoor waterfall, with a taste for Cuban cigars and Scotch whiskey. Stafford beer was clearly no run-of-the-mill socialist. Nonetheless, he agreed to assist, keen geographically to scale up cybernetics, to move from the level of the factory, the scale at which he had previously operated. Brain of the Firm was the title of his 1972 book, to a national scale. Beer thought Chile would be the world's most striking cybernetics project. But after he decided to take the job, his son said, "We thought Stafford is going mad again." Possibly this was true. He was never the same again after Chile. Going rogue and evident from this photo taken in his remote Welsh cottage. Obviously, no three-piece handmade tailored suits here, or Cuban cigars, or a remote controlled indoor waterfall. So a transdisciplinary inquiry, cybernetics, was first formulated in 1948 by the American mathematician and pioneering computer scientist Norbert Wiener. It emerged from his attempt to control and to manage and to realize specific ends within highly complex systems. Wiener's cybernetic solution was based on the model of the ancient Greek helmsperson, who continually adjusted the tiller on their boat in response to, that is, feedback from external signals like winds, currents, and tides. Those external complexities could not be dominated, fully predicted, but only coped with, dealt with, as they erratically emerged in the moment. The idea directly came from Wiener's work in the Second World War in trying to design an anti-aircraft gun that autonomously readjusted its aim on an enemy plane in response to the real-time changing evasive maneuvers of the plane itself. The pilot's mental state and intentions were put to one side, black boxed, with only feedback information from the external movements of the aircraft used to guide the anti-aircraft's guns, continual adjustments. Given these martial origins, perhaps unsurprisingly, cybernetics became a Cold War staple. Less so in Britain, which had its own ideational cybernetic lineage from the psychiatrist Ross Ashby, that rather than machinic was organic. This was Stafford Beer's tradition. A cybernetic model was the brain, conceived as an organ of performance, of doing things, of finding ways in the moment to cope creatively in real time with a changing, complex external environment. Beer's cybernetics was a means to cope with and adapt to the unknowable. Information gathered was not used to represent the world, to enframe it, but like Wiener's anti-aircraft guns, as learning machines, to adapt, to intervene, to act, to perform, to change. Beard's meeting with Flores was epiphanic. Beard was disgusted by American intervention in Chile. He joined up enthusiastic about the progressive social and economic possibilities of mobilizing cybernetics. Beard's end, writes Andy Beckett, was to implant an electronic cybernetic nervous system in Chilean society, a sort of socialist internet. intermittently living in Chile from late 1971, Beer and a set of radical Chilean engineers, the Santiago boys, rapidly developed Project CyberSyn. CyberSyn used cybernetic methods to connect state control and decision-making to newly nationalized production facilities. CyberSyn had three components. CyberNet consisted of 500 telex machines placed in a different state production facility, connected by telephone line to a mainframe computer in Santiago. In 1972, there were only 4 computers, mainframe computers, in the country, but Flores ensured CyberSyn got one. The borough's 3,500. Those telex machines were bought by a previous government, but mothballed because of lack of expertise in operating them. Serendipitously found in a forgotten warehouse, Beer enrolled them in his project. CyberSyn, or CyberStride, the second component, was involved in real-time collection of carefully constructed index data from state-owned plants. That was then sent to the computer for bespoke statistical analysis designed by local engineers in discussion with British consultants and used then in short-term forecasting models. The operations room, the third component, looked like a cross between the bridge of the Starship Enterprise and the Athenaeum Club. Octagonal, wood-paneled, with 7 padded swivel chairs arranged in a circle, each with generous armrests, accommodating built-in cigar ashtrays and drink tumbler holders. There were also many buttons to press that operated monitors, display screens, slide projectors, and hidden sliding panels. Paper was banned. As Evgeny Morozov says, Beer was building the future, and it had to look like the future. Although called the ops room, in line with cybernetics, it was less a site for making hierarchical top-down commands than a creative, pliable space for continual on-the-fly revision as an ultimately unknowable world made yet another surprising turn. As Andrew Pickering puts it, the control room was a continual experimental exploration and reaction to a world that could be never fully known. After seeing what the ops room and CyberSyn might do for a Chilean socialist planned economy, on September the 10th, 1973, Allende made plans for it to be brought in to the presidential palace. The very next day, though, Allende was dead. He most likely shot himself rather than surrender to Pinochet's troops. The palace was a smoking ruin, and the Chilean experiment with CyberSyn socialism was permanently deep-sexed. What followed after this second crisis, the military coup, was yet another experiment with a different knowledge in transit. Not the Santiago boys, but Los Chicago boys, more well-known, coming with their own 2015 award-winning film. Los Chicago boys' experiment was not to deploy a novel means to realize socialism, but to deploy a brutal means to realize free market neoliberalism. Pinochet's violent military dictatorship potentially opened up wide possibilities for the future shape of the economy. Whatever the junta chose, no one would or could protect Pinochet chose neoliberalism. This is a reminder, as Jamie Peck writes, that, quote, neoliberalization is not some automatic system, but is an earthly process realized through political action and institutional reinvention. It is not some disembodied artifact of political theory, but has a pulse. In Pinochet's Chile, neoliberalism's pulse was sometimes maintained at the expense of fully embodied human beings losing theirs. Peck also made the argument in his book, Constructions of Neoliberal Reason, that there is no single origin point, geographical or otherwise, for neoliberalism. There are only network nodes and transit points, the roles of which only make sense in relation to one another, as Peck says. There are key individuals, though, along with their writings, and one was the University of Chicago's economist, Milton Friedman. He was a participant at the very first Mont Pelerin Swiss mountaintop meeting in 1947, organized by the Austrian economist Friedrich von Hayek. Hayek, author of the 1944 tract, The Road to Serfdom, which warned against the tyranny of any form of state central planning, founded Mont Pelerin to provide the alternative view to the galloping socialism he saw sweeping across Eastern and Western Europe. That alternative and formalized on the Swiss mountaintop was neoliberalism, classical liberalism made over for new times. Friedman was an early convert, later writing in 1962 his own version of The Road to Serfdom for an American audience, Capitalism and Freedom. In 1956, Friedman's Chicago Hyde Park neoliberalism first branched out as a network to form a new Chilean node. Early in the Cold War, the US ambassador to Chile, William Bolak, identified the University of Chile's College of Economics as a communist nest. To counteract this socialist way of thinking, a brand new arm of the State Department, the International Cooperation Administration, sponsored an agreement, the Chile project, between the University of Chicago Economics Department and the Pontificate Catholic University of Chile, to bring Chilean economic graduate students to the University of Chicago. The Chicago economist Arnold Harberger was appointed academic and personal mentor, with all students taking Friedman's compulsory graduate foundation course in economic theory. Between 1956 and 1964, 26 Chilean economic graduate students participated. They returned to Chile with a mission, supporting right-wing politics and policies. After graduating, some of these students went to work in universities, others into banks or into large corporations. They bided their time, their ideas continuing to simmer within the protective shelter of right-wing think tanks like Augustine Edwards Center for Socioeconomic Studies. They were waiting.
Just to say we're very nearly at the end of your time, so if you could summarize and we can take a couple of questions from the floor, I would much appreciate it.
Okay, I would like to get to my conclusion. We did start slightly later, I think. So let me just read the quote from Friedman. So Friedman said, crisis was absolutely critical. It produces real change. Once that occurs, ideas lying around become available for use as the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable. What was produced was a blueprint for neoliberalism by the Los Chicago boys in Chile. This was the idea that was lying around that they then picked up. It was turned into a mammoth text and then implemented once the Pinochet regime came to power. So neoliberalism was no longer traveling, it had arrived. But in order for it to arrive, cybernetic socialism had to die. It had come to the end of the road. But of course, neoliberalism was only just starting and has undertaken, in effect, a 50-year road trip, going to almost every place in the world. And like not knowledge in transit more generally, as it's traveled, it's mutated, taking different forms. And those different forms are a result of it coming into friction, to use Anna Tsing's term, with various stubborn place-specific institutions and practices. And those place-based frictions don't stop neoliberalism. They simply change it, allowing it to adapt to its environment. So, as always, geography matters. So, thank you very much. I'm sorry if I went slightly over time.
Trevor, do we have any very quick questions at all from the room or online? Anyone online? No? Okay, well, because of time, we will move on as quickly as possible to our next speaker, Henry James Meiring, who's joining us from Griffith University. I assume it's very, what might be considered antisocial time down in Brisbane at the moment. And Henry's going to speak to us on practical knowledge, Darwin and the American print industry. So you've got some slides. Would you like to share your screen and take it away, please?
All right, I hope everyone can hear me. The history of the so-called Darwinian revolution has more often than not been told as a history of ideas. A triumphant narrative of Charles Darwin's evolutionary vision of nature, defeating the theological doctrine of creation, spreading from the empire's cosmopolitan center to the colonies and beyond, and thereby ushering in a new scientific age. What's missing from these Whiggish and diffusionist accounts are the less glamorous, but crucial material actors and practices that underpinned this transformation. My talk today is therefore an attempt to rethink this familiar episode in the history of science by situating it within the history of the book and reading. By examining the global circulation of Darwin's ideas through the everyday ink-stained practices of printers, binders, paper makers, publishers, and readers, I will show how what I've come to call piratical knowledge came to play a central role in the making of the Darwinian revolution. This approach also allows us to integrate this episode into the larger historical narratives of capitalism, consumption, globalization, and modernity. Shortly after the first advertisements appeared for Darwin's long-awaited Descent of Man in October 1869, Charles Layton, the London agent for the American publishing house D. Appleton, anxiously wrote to Darwin in order to acquire the copyrights to Darwin's forthcoming book for an American edition. Appleton offered Darwin generous terms, prepared to pay 10% royalties on each copy sold, a testament to Darwin's reputation as author and the strong demand for his works in the American market. But what exactly was Appleton buying? The United States at the time did not recognize the British, or for that matter, international copyright, and as such, Appleton was under no legal obligation to pay either Darwin or his London publisher, John Murray, for the right to publish Descent. Instead, what Appleton was really paying for was to gain an advantage over their fellow American publishers. By securing an advance copy of the book before any of their competitors, Appleton would be able to gain a healthy head start when it came to publishing Darwin's latest work on human evolution. This was especially important because trade courtesy in American publishing was based on two interrelated principles of priority and association. The principle of priority meant that the publisher first to publicly announce the production of a foreign work had the right to control the publication of that book without competition from others. The second principle of trade courtesy, the rule of association, meant that a publisher who initially reprinted the work of a foreign author could exercise a claim on all that author's subsequent works, thus associating that author with the house. However, the self-regulating system amongst publishers was by no means perfect and often failed to deter others from pirating books, especially from the 1870s onwards, as the cheap book movement gained momentum in America. Often the best-case scenario for publishers such as Appleton was to control the early sales of the book before the inevitable pirated editions flooded the market. Appleton therefore furnished Darwin with a strict set of instructions on the eve of Descent's publication in order to minimize the risk posed by the print pirates, writing to the naturalist, "It is very important for us that the book should come out simultaneously in the two countries," and went on to explain that Mr. Longman delayed sending sheets in regard to Mr. Mill's book on women, and although we were bound to pay Mr. Mill a copyright on the sales, the plates came so late that a Philadelphia house got the book out in advance of us and undersold us, hence they had nothing to pay to the author. And therefore Appleton requested to have the sheets sent just as they go through the English press. Darwin complied with Appleton's request, leading to the concurrent publication of Descent in Britain and the United States. However, unlike Appleton's dependence on trade courtesy, John Murray in Britain relied on Her Majesty's government to protect his and Darwin's interests. By registering the copyright under Darwin's name, both publisher and author would be technically protected from illegal reprinting throughout the empire for the next 42 years. And here on the screen, you can see a copy of the form that was filled out by John Murray. And you can also see that Descent of Man's copyright expires in 1913. Yet for Darwin, his translators and publishers, piracy was a real concern in other parts of the globe. For example, in 1872, Darwin was informed by his Russian translator, Vladimir Kovalevsky, that the authorized publication of Descent had incurred heavy losses due to the appearance of two pirated, abridged editions of the work selling at very low prices. Kovalevsky reminded Darwin that there was no treaty between Russia and Britain, and that every successful book printed in England is sure to be published in an abridged and bad translation, which by its low price cuts entirely all profits of good and complete editions. Darwin also instructed his French translator to hurry up and publish out of fear that a pirated edition might appear before the official translation, especially as the book had been very successful in most other countries, with sales in America reaching 8,000 copies in less than 5 months. The demand in America was indeed quite spectacular. In the first year alone, Appleton printed 23,000 volumes and managed to sell over 20,000 copies, eclipsing sales in Britain by more than 4,000 copies. The book's status as bestseller did not go unnoticed by the competition, resulting in the American company Glaxton, Remsen and Heffelfinger to publish the first cheap pirated edition of Descent in 1873. Readers could now purchase the book in a smaller single volume for a mere $1. Compare this to Appleton's edition, which consisted out of a larger format, 2 volumes, and was sold for $2 per volume or $4 per set. Or imported British editions, which were being sold by Little, Brown & Co. for an eye-watering $10. Glaxton, Remsen and Heffelfinger was the first American company to pirate Descent, but certainly not the last. For the period that Descent was under copyright in Britain, so between 1871 and 1913, at least 35 pirated editions were published by 21 American publishers. An illustrative example is the edition published by the Humboldt Publishing Company. And as you can see here on the screen, it was printed in double columns on very cheap paper. And here in the back, when we look at the advertisements, you can get a real sense for the purpose and the rationale, and also sort of how morality came to be seen by some of these pirated publishers. So the Humboldt Library of Science was meant to print popular scientific works at very low prices of what they called the masterminds of the 19th century. And here, if we look at the philosophy that they purport, I'll just read this because I think it's quite important. In short, producing a revolution in the intellectual and moral world. So that's sort of the goal of the series. No educated person, whatever his calling, can afford to keep himself out of the main current of contemporary scientific research and exposition. The price of the several numbers is 15 cents each, double numbers 30 cents, which is less than 1/10 what is charged by London and New York publishers for exactly the same reading matter. And the next section, I think, is really important. The Humboldt Library is published semi-monthly and mailed free to any address in the United States, Canada, or Mexico on receipt of $3. To Great Britain, France, and Japan, etc., for $4 a year. And what's really important here is to note that technically exporting these books to anywhere in the British Empire, including Canada and Great Britain, was of course illegal. But this did not deter the American publishers. And on the other side, you can actually see the advertisement for the Cent. And what's really interesting here is that the Cent was not sold as a complete book, but rather was sold in parts. So many American readers could buy parts of the book for a mere 15 cents, unbounded, the sheets of paper. So this really opens up the diversity of readership. And here's just another example of the book contrasted to the original Murray edition. And if you look at the illustrations, you can really see a difference in the quality of the illustrations. It's also important to note that in the original, of course, the illustrations appear in text, as opposed to in this cheap Humboldt pirated copy, where they appear at the back on plates. And another interesting feature of the Humboldt copy, for instance, is that almost around only half of the actual illustrations were included to save costs. Now, the proliferation of unauthorized copies forced Appleton to start adding the phrase authorized edition to their later copies. And these cheap pirated copies would have greatly impacted Appleton's sales of the Cent, but also posed serious problems for sales in Britain. The American refusal to acknowledge foreign copyright throughout the 19th century was a constant thorn in the side of British authors, publishers, and legislators. For example, Samuel Goodrich, an American publisher, estimated in 1820 that at least 70% of American book manufacture concerned reprinting the work of British authors. These cheaper and most often than not of lesser quality copies did not only deprive foreign authors from receiving compensation in America, but also threatened other markets, especially those of Britain and its colonies. Many American reprints were smuggled into Britain during the 19th century, and by the mid-1830s, British publishers were much exercised by the presence of American copies in London bookshops and circulating libraries. Colonial markets were themselves particularly vulnerable to cheap American reprints, as readers were often starved of adequate and affordable reading material. This was especially true when it came to Canada, which was the #1 export market for American books. Amongst those illegal copies being smuggled back into Britain was Darwin's Descent of Man. For example, in 1906, a Mr. Duncan Campbell wrote to John Murray about a shipment of illegal Descent copies that was inadvertently shipped to the UK. Writing, "Sir, the following work of Charles Darwin, of which I understand you are the proprietor of the copyright, has been detained by Her Majesty's Customs at Glasgow under the provisions of the Foreign Reprints Act. The Commissioners of Customs will allow the said books to be reshipped to New York on the receipt of the written permission of the owner of the copyright, which permission I now earnestly ask you to grant. Otherwise, the books will be destroyed by Her Majesty's Customs." The very next year, John Murray received another letter, this time from Customs, who had once again seized illegal copies of Descent. The official informed Murray that it was customary to destroy all such works, but they are now, when the proprietors of the copyright grant their permission, handed over to the Trinity House for use in the lightships and lighthouses on the coast of Great Britain and Ireland. Before adding, the gift of such books to the libraries of lightships and lighthouses can hardly be detrimental to the sale of the works in the United Kingdom. So we can easily imagine a solitary lighthouse keeper along a God-forsaken stretch of coast, reading his pirated copy of Descent. The problem of international copyright, especially the lack of an Anglo-American treaty, remained unresolved and in 1875 became the focus of the Royal Commission on Copyright. Thomas Henry Farrer, permanent secretary to the Board of Trade, played a leading role in this commission, giving evidence on several occasions and arguing that British publishers were to blame for establishing monopolies, selling books at extortionate prices at the expense of the public good, which required high volume sales at cheap prices. Farrer's investigations led him to approach authors of international repute, including Charles Darwin. Writing to Darwin, "Have I not heard you say that Appleton of New York treats you liberally in the matter of your books, thou without copyright? Do you know at all whether other publishers in the US print your books without saying anything to you or to Appleton? And have you noticed whether a large number of them are sold there and are sold in this country? And are they sold at a lower price there? I am much interested in copyright and I'm asking these questions for my own instruction and should not, of course, mention your name to anyone. I have come to the conclusion that our publishers' trade in this country is a close and protected trade, and that they would do better for authors and for the public if they were to publish at lower prices. The English-speaking people abroad will not and ought not submit to their terms." Now, unfortunately, Darwin's response has not survived. But what is important for our purposes is that Darwin's work was simultaneously entangled in piracy, but also became entangled in governmental attempts to end it. So why should we care about piracy and the role of piratical knowledge in the history of science? Well, the sheer numbers of pirated copies printed between 1871 and 1913 meant that the majority of English-speaking people across the world would have read Descent in a pirated edition as opposed to reading the official and authorized publications of John Murray and Appleton. The act of piracy was therefore not peripheral to the Darwinian revolution, but rather a central force in the dissemination of Darwinism across the globe. And by studying the production of piratical knowledge, we are able to enlarge our picture of the development of science, fundamentally altering our understanding of how scientific knowledge was produced and consumed on a global scale. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Henry, for an excellent talk. Do we have any questions from in the room first? Well, I can always ask one about this. I'm particularly interested in the 18th century, and we all know from people like Robert Darnton's work that figures such as Voltaire actively stimulated the piracy of their books to what Darnton described as the process of spreading enlightenment. Basically, I want to know how annoyed Darwin actually was. I mean, did he ultimately view the exact copying of his books and the more general circulation of them to be a success because the idea was out there, or did he actually, like John Murray, care about the money?
Well, thanks, Edwin. That's a really good question. I think the evidence that we do have shows that Darwin preferred actually to hand select his translators and also his publishers overseas. And the few times he did speak about piracy, he was clearly quite annoyed. For example, in the slide I showed with his French publisher, where he definitely didn't want a pirated edition to appear before his. So in some ways, a figure like Darwin, I think, piracy would have been unwelcomed, partly also because Darwin's own concern for his translators and publishers. So he felt a obligation towards, especially his translators, and to a lesser extent to the publishers of said foreign works, and was very much aware that they were the ones that really got hurt by the pirated editions, and not him. So in Darwin's case, I think piracy, like I said, was not welcomed.
Thanks. Anyone else in here? Anyone online?
We have a question from Judith Friedman. Were there any instances where the editing of the text that took place as the books were pirated fundamentally changed the ideas which were presented?
Thanks for that really good question, Judith. I think not particularly, although what I would say is that the books themselves, the material objects, and the what one can think of sort of extra textual bits and structural components often did instruct readers to read the book in various different ways. So many of these books often would have introductions, sometimes notes, essays by other people writing about Darwin or critiquing Darwin, or instructing readers how they should interpret the text. So it really does depend. I mean, there's as many Darwins as there are editions of his work, and that includes also not just the pirated editions, but also just the foreign editions of his work. So it really does matter to think about what, when we think about people being influenced or engaging with Darwin, it really does matter what book they actually read.
Well, thank you very much, Henry. As we've been told, only a couple of questions to speak about. His email address on the screen here if you want to follow up. Well, again, thanks a lot. And we'll now move on to our next speaker, who is Shelburne from Harvard University, who's going to be speaking to us about plagiarizing, provincializing Western science. Suavi's 1869 History of Turkish Science. So take it away. I'll just add that we are running slightly late, so we might have to go into the coffee break at the end by a couple of minutes. But do take it away.
Thank you. I'll go as quickly as I can then and try to get you all to your coffee break on time. First of all, just a big thank you. I don't know everybody there, but I really appreciate your technical support. I imagine it's quite a headache. And it means a lot that I'm able to participate despite being far away on the West Coast of the United States. It's a real privilege to be on this panel with my distinguished co-panelists. So thank you. Thanks to you both for having me on with you guys. And I'll just note that on this first slide, there is a QR code. I'm not sure how visible that is to everybody in the room, but it includes a link to a Google Drive containing my slides here and my script. If that'd be helpful to anybody to follow along that way, please feel free to use it. And without any further ado, I'm just going to get going. Oh, sorry, make sure. Okay, so I'm going to start with a quote from David Urquhart, who was a Scottish dropout from Oxford, who fought with the Greeks during their war for independence against the Ottoman Empire, but later actually became a diplomat and a member of parliament who was really known for his defense of the Ottoman Empire and Turkish society. In his publications, he rejects pretty much every Western stereotype about the Turks, but he does admit one such stereotype, their backwardness in matters of science. But Urquhart actually contests the explanation for this backwardness. Most people blame, and I quote, their rejection of everything foreign and their want of imitativeness, but he says that the case is exactly the reverse. They are actually too imitative. The problem is that they've imitated the wrong people, the Persian and Arab civilizations, which led them to neglect European discoveries and which encumbered their language with all these foreign words and structures to the point that the Ottoman language is nearly impossible to learn, which I can actually confirm as somebody still very much a student of the Ottoman language. So with that in mind, this talk is an offshoot from my dissertation. It's kind of a little part of a dissertation chapter that examines how the history of science was narrated by Ottoman intellectuals and their foreign interlocutors, like Urquhart, in the 19th century. The quote shows the high stakes of the 19th century history of science, especially as Ottoman elites considered the future of their society. Could it ever have a scientific community of its own? And was that potentially the key to their political and cultural survival? But I'm going to set those questions aside and focus instead on a different theme. That is Urquhart's emphasis on imitation as a vital part of science. Studying the history of circulating knowledge often brings up questions of imitation and translation, as well as piracy, as we just heard about. And this is especially true when we consider intellectual networks that extend beyond the West. But I've often found these metaphors lacking. Even if we emphasize that translation involves transformation, I think it still invokes a center-periphery relationship that all of us are a little bit uncomfortable with. And after all, in the case of Urquhart, Turkish imitation is really an excuse for British exceptionalism. His goal is to reorient the Turks towards what he sees as true civilization, i.e. Great Britain. And I think the contrast of pictures there on the right perhaps captures that sense of civilization. When it comes to my materials, the problem is that the center-periphery model often fits. Ottoman intellectuals looked west for cutting-edge scholarship, and they embraced the imitativeness that Urquhart recommends. So today, I want to sit with my own discomfort with the diffusionist model through this theme of imitation versus originality. Is an imitation really as scientific or as impressive as a piece of original scholarship? And what separates imitations from originals in the first place? I'm going to suggest that reevaluating what it means to be original is crucial to studying knowledge and circulation. So I want to explore these themes through a rather extreme case study. This article, which is titled Turk or the Turk, which was written and published by an Ottoman intellectual named Ali Suavi in 1869. I first read this article as part of my research on how Ottomans wrote the history of science, but I soon learned that as early as 1928, the historian Fuat Köprülü had suggested that Suavi had copied rather liberally from the English Orientalist Arthur Lumley Davids, to the extent that the article was, in his words, written secondhand. I, of course, wanted to study the essay as an original contribution, and so I decided to try to identify which parts of the essay were plagiarized and which parts were original, a rabbit hole that I am still tumbling down. So first, a little bit on the substance of the article. It was published in Ali Suavi's self-published newspaper, Ulum Gazetesi, which roughly translates to Journal of the Sciences or Journal of Science. And as you can see from this cover on the right, Suavi framed the journal as encyclopedic. He planned to include reviews of recent books, including actually Darwin, full bibliographies of contemporary sciences, and complete translations of at least one book from each discipline. He never really achieved those goals, but that was his dream. The article that I'm studying is actually the very first article in the very first issue of the journal. So it immediately seems very important to set the tone. And its first line reads, quote, "There is a race problem in Europe," which is still true today. This word race is a direct transliteration of the French word race. So it wouldn't have been immediately legible to an Ottoman reader. And accordingly, Suavi hastens to explain this problem as, quote, "the branch of science concerned with judging a people's abilities and talent." And in line with this title, the first two pages actually offer a kind of racial genealogy of the Turks, ranging from biblical times to the modern groups like the Uyghurs, the Tatars, and of course, the Ottomans. So these passages at the beginning of the essay have attracted a great deal of attention in the Ottoman historiography because they appear to foreshadow the pan-Turkist movement that dominated Ottoman politics in the early 20th century, and that brought us the Republic of Turkey today. More importantly, these sections are not plagiarized from Lumley-Davids, and thus they appear to be an original contribution, in this case, a very early articulation of Turkism. But when you look at the article in full, I think the real topic is not race science or introducing his readers to race science, but instead the history of science as told through the lens of race. A few famous individuals, he explains, have characterized the Turk as a crude soldier void of intellectual labor. And that's a phrase I want you to hold on to because I think it captures this idea of imitation. In the conclusion, Suavi points to a universal dictionary of history and geography written in French and edited by Nicolas Bouillet, which says in the article on Turkey, quote, "The Turks are in effect nearly universally foreign to all intellectual culture." So Suavi's article is essentially a rebuttal. He argues that Turks, and especially Ottomans, are and have always been active contributors to human knowledge. So looking over the contents with this framing in mind, the short background, the racial genealogy part, is only meant to set the scope of the sections that follow, each of which is essentially a biographical bibliography of the intellectual contributions of Turks before and during the Ottoman period. And across all of these sections, Suavi mentions many different scholars to support his argument, including Western Orientalists like Antoine Galland, Giambattista Toderini, and the aforementioned Lumley-Davids. For the historians of science in the room, Suavi offers a very familiar image of universal science, here emphasizing the role of Turkic peoples in its development and transmission. And he concludes that though the Ottoman Empire has fallen behind very recently, he is confident that, and I quote, "The knowledge in Europe will pass to the hands of the peoples of the East, and in their hands it will grow." So while in a sense he is provincializing Europe, he also plagiarizes it. And for a visual example, for those of us that can't read Ottoman, he tries to copy the Chinese characters that Lumley-Davids includes in his discussion of the origin of the name Turk. As one commentator, Ahmed Hamdi Tanpınar, writes, Suavi differs from Lumley-Davids only with a number of additions, omissions, and commentaries in favor of his case. And that case itself, in Tanpınar's view, is so polemical as to be ridiculous. For example, Suavi quotes an English scholar named Mr. Bailey on how the Turks, and I quote, "brought learning, industry, civilization, and refinement to the world." The Bailey in question is in fact a French scholar, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, who wrote an influential book on Plato's story of Atlantis and its possible location in Central Asia. As Tanpınar points out, Suavi's quote is in fact from Lumley-Davids' summary of Bailly, which is probably why Suavi mistakes him for an Englishman. And as you can see from the comparison that I've put on the screen here, Suavi exaggerates the Turks' purported discoveries and entirely omits Lumley-Davids' skepticism. So Tanpınar and other critics seem to be right. Most of the article, even things that appear to come from other authors, are simply Lumley-Davids, strategically translated into a more polemical form. But my research suggests that Suavi is a bit more sophisticated in his plagiarism. As I read through the sources he mentions himself, I realized that Lumley-Davids is not the only one translated without citation. Earlier, I described the racial background section of the article, which has been deemed one of the only original passages. But it turns out that those sections are uncited translations of articles in Bouillet's Universal Dictionary. Yes, that exact same Bouillet that Suavi cites for the Western stereotype of Turks' scientific incapacity, the Bouillet who partially inspired the article. Bouillet himself is also a source for some of the profiles in the biobibliographic sections. A paragraph on Avicenna or Ibn Sina, for instance, is taken from the associated article in Bouillet, though Suavi notably adds that Ibn Sina was, quote, raised from Turks, where Bouillet indicates that he was born in Persia. So Suavi is clearly committed to trying to make Ibn Sina a kind of Turk. I haven't finished doing this painstaking detective work of comparing texts across the entire article, But at this point, I'm convinced that most of the content is compiled from Lumley-Davids, Bouillet, and a few other histories and encyclopedias. Only the brief introduction, a few topic sentences, and the conclusion appear to be original. So Tom Pinar is wrong that Suavi is simply parroting Davids, but he is right that this piece is mostly plagiarized, with Suavi's additions and omissions aimed at bolstering his argument. So the best way I've come up with to describe this article is as a collage, a mix of bits from various sources, carefully cut, arranged, and overlapped to present a distinct image within a new frame. The finished work is evidently the result of some effort. Suavi probably discovered this historiographic stereotype of the crude soldier when he arrived in France, and he began collecting citations to disprove it, leading to what I think is a fairly haphazard and uneven enumeration of people that makes up the bulk of this article. So as a historian of science, being able to trace these various sources is quite interesting. The article itself becomes a kind of archive of what Suavi was reading while he was in exile in Paris. But can this kind of historiographic collage actually be treated as an original contribution? The slide you're looking at is actually a kind of collage that I made to show Suavi's plagiarism, which is an object in the digital exhibition accompanying this conference. So I want to offer some interpretations and even justifications of this plagiarism. We might blame his material circumstances. Like an undergraduate cramming at the end of the semester, Suavi was short on time and money, and he needed to publish his new journal quickly. We might also say that he's a deliberate fraud. He's misrepresenting his sources and using uncited knowledge to establish his own authority and his expertise to his readers, who, after all, would probably have been unable to confirm any of his claims or check the sources that he mentions. And I think in this case, we would conclude that Suavi sacrifices academic integrity to boost his own authority and to get his point across. But I'm sympathetic to, or trying to create, a third interpretation, that Suavi did not consider this fraud because he did not intend this to be original scholarship in the way that we might understand it. His goal is instead, first, to defend the scientific capacity of the Turks, and second, to model how to respond to this Orientalist stereotype for his Ottoman readers. I'm not suggesting that plagiarism wasn't a concept among Ottoman intellectuals. Indeed, Suavi himself, he clearly knows how to quote, just when he wants to. But he isn't concerned, in this article at least, about the details of who said what, but rather he wants to amass a collage of evidence, whatever the source, to disprove Turks' scientific incapacity. And he removes anything that complicates that argument, and he happily quotes Europeans when they compliment it. My point here is that Suavi understands his writing as not just knowledge creation, but as knowledge orientation. So, what's our verdict? If the existing historiography is our guide, the interesting parts of this piece were those that were original, i.e. not copied from Lumley-Davids. My investigation suggests that even those parts were plagiarized, only from different authors, which leaves us forced to conclude that Suavi is even more guilty than we thought. There is still the concluding section, which I can talk about in the QA, but overall, Suavi's work is largely determined by the West. His authority figures, his racial ontology, and his definition of science all seem to show the process of Westernization among Ottoman intellectuals. The imitation, in fact, that Urquhart wanted. In other words, Suavi's plagiarism itself becomes an unfortunate proof of the scientific disparity he is aiming to dispute. But this verdict would assume the value of originality and concentrates on the text itself. What if we position it instead within knowledge circulation rather than knowledge production? And here, I find it easier to think about the turn in the history of technology from a focus on innovation and invention to a focus on use and maintenance and knockoffs and that sort of thing. Can historians of science, too, use circulating knowledge to make a similar turn, reevaluating what counts as the work of science rather than a work of science? Sorry. In the case of Suavi's collage, I believe the sum is actually greater than its parts. As I described above, the article is a kind of playbook for the Ottoman reader whenever they encounter the crude soldier stereotype, be it in print or in person. And I think in this respect, Suavi actually succeeds. One 1896 work on the history of Turkish science invokes some of the same stories and evidence, and in fact, the same stereotype of the Turk as a, quote, simple raider or a crude soldier, which corresponds almost exactly to Suavi's wording. Historians have largely focused on Suavi's article as a theory of Turkishness, but I believe its contribution to the history of science was both his intention and its actual influence. So, is it plagiarized? Absolutely. But is it still an original contribution to the history of science? I think the answer might also be yes, if we think that originality is not just about information, but also use. So I want to conclude by reflecting on how we evaluate scientific writing or the history of science writing today. Plagiarism is, of course, much more well-defined, and we have systems like peer review, which would presumably catch this sort of thing. The tone of academic writing, at least in the history of science, is also very different. I don't think that Suavi's bombast would make it very far in this conference, at least. But as Carla Nappi has pointed out, there is still a tension between what many of us want to see as a discipline working to expand beyond its North American and European centers, and the differences in perspective, language, and style among local historiographies, including that ostensibly universal one that many of us are a part of. Nappi suggests that we have two choices: to police our boundaries and harmonize the field, or to embrace the diversity of voices at the risk of losing a sense of disciplinary unity. I think that this question might also be reframed as one of imitation and originality. Do we expect the global South to imitate the Euro-American standard, while at the same time critiquing them for their imitativeness? Questioning our expectations of genre in our field is vital to both studying and practicing the circulation of knowledge. Suavi's article could not be published in an academic journal today, but examining the details of its creation helped me, at least, to become more open to alternative forms and styles of scholarship, both historically and today. I'm not about to abandon the methods that I've learned in graduate school, most of all the genealogical method of tracing ideas and practices back to their origins. But I'm also trying to remain aware of how my focus on genealogies, which after all inspired me to do this deep dive into Suavi sources, can also conceal what's right in front of me. Giving some credit to Suavi might open up a different kind of scholarship that embraces the messiness and contradictions of a collage, and in doing so might come up with something new. Big thank you to my committee members, Himet Tashkumur, and all of my different support groups, and I'm happy to take questions now.
Thank you very much, Luna. Do we have any questions in the room? Yes. Well, I think that's all right. So, could you hear me? Can you hear? You might need to come up to the.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Was somebody asking a question? Because I couldn't hear it at all. I apologize.
So you could hear me, or I should come before. Yeah. Close. Obvious. Yeah.
So you hear me, right?
Yes, I can hear you better now. Thank you.
Well, that's a great presentation. I enjoyed a lot. So I have two questions. So the first question is, how do you understand plagiarism in the context of your research? Because today plagiarism, it means like hiding your sources, but it's a deliberate, right, choice of hiding the sources. Do you think that Ali Suavi hides his sources deliberately? So how do you understand plagiarism? I think that's important because plagiarism is a very loaded term, right, today. So, so I think maybe, yeah, can you please elaborate on how you announce your understanding of plagiarism, again, in the context of the late Ottoman period? So the second question that I have, so have you come across any influence of Ali Suavi's perspective on subsequent generations in defending sort of like nation to the history of science. Thank you so much. It was great.
Okay, those are two fantastic questions. I assume you know a lot about Ottoman history. As far as the definition of plagiarism, I can't speak with any authority on what plagiarism would have meant at the time. But I think your emphasis on the intention is really key, at least to how we understand it today. And that's why I'm using the word plagiarism. Suavi is intentionally translating stuff without citation. And the reason I say that is because there are large passages that are translated, and then he very deliberately mentions his sources and quotes them when he wants to. And so this is deliberate concealment of where he's taking his material. And in that sense, I think it would count as plagiarism today. And that's how I'm understanding that. As far as the concept of the nation, this is often associated with Suavi, at least his sort of Turkish side of him. A lot of people also consider him more of an Islamic thinker, but we won't get into that. This particular article, I think, is much less important for the concept of nationality. I would point you to some of his other work to sort of support that, and I'm happy to get into the details, but I don't think that that's as important to the question of imitation and plagiarism.
Thank you for your very, very interesting talk. My question regards what is the concept of originality? And my question is, to what extent is originality also part of the movement which produces modern science? So in that sense, if you consider, for instance, science as accumulation of truthful knowledge, that is something different from contributing something new. And my question is, how does this interfere with your interpretation?
Fantastic question. And I really liked how you framed or you discussed science as a sort of accumulation of knowledge, because I think that is a way that a lot of us understand it as historians of science. And yet I think that there's a real temptation to look for those moments of novelty, right? We talk a lot about communication, circulation, but I think especially when you're writing about Ottoman science, people always ask me, well, what did they invent? What did they come up with? Was there something new that they actually contributed to global universal science? And that's sort of the puzzle that I'm trying to get at in this talk, and I don't have a very clear answer. But one thing that I will say is that I think the emphasis on originality comes less from scientists themselves and more from historians of science. And among them is Suavi himself. So his article, of course, is not very original, but in his discussion of Turk's contributions, he's very focused on originality. He wants to show when they came up with something new and when it had a very broad impact because of that novelty. And I think that that's generally true of 19th century historians of science. And I think that that's where we get our current inheritance, where it's so important to prove priority.
Questions from on Zoom, or one very quick question anyway. Unless you want to go to coffee. No one on Zoom? Well, I'd like to say to thank all of us because for three very, very interesting talks.